Hello, my name is Richard McConnell from Context 1 Heritage and Archaeology, and this is a summary of the evaluation we carried out at North Quay in June of 2021. As far as we know, this marks the first ever archaeological investigation into the historic core of Weymouth, and we were pleased to have been commissioned to carry out the work on behalf of Dorset Council. This presentation was originally prepared for the Dorset Past and Present 2021 webinar. For those of you who don't know, the site is the former home of Weymouth and Portland Borough Council offices and situated on the south side of the harbour and close to the present town bridge and Holy Trinity Church. The ground rises sharply at the rear of the site towards Chapel Hay, while the offices are surrounded on three sides by a public car park. Taken together, they occupy the historic location of Weymouth High Street. This is a similar view of the High Street in the 1920s and a very different scene. The highlighted areas show much of what is presently covered by the office block and car park and reflects an eclectic mix of commercial and residential buildings, tightly packed together either side of the High Street. This is a view from the street itself in the early years of the 20th century and further emphasises a mixture of building forms and styles that suggest a rather organic and piecemeal evolution of the town. Note the narrow and rather medieval-looking street. The entire street was demolished and cleared in the early 1960s, having been in decline for some decades, a trend that was hastened by the loss of buildings through blast damage during the Second World War and the deprivations of life immediately after. Despite the town suffering extensive bombing and loss of life during the earlier years of the war at least, the incident books kept at the time do not record any direct bomb damage on the High Street, although numerous properties suffered secondary damage from bombs dropped on Chapel Hay and Franchise Street on the higher ground above. A map of the High Street in 1958 identifies numerous ruins testifying to buildings so badly damaged that they were either left or cleared. The photo at the top left of the slide captures the 1960s demolition in progress, with the red star marking the location of buildings left as rubble following blast damage. This also happens to have been the location of one of our trenches. While we were digging there, a lady walking by explained that it was the site of her grandmother's house and who was living there when it suffered severe damage. She had to leave for good, and the lady remembered playing in the ruin with her friends both during and after the war. The photo at the bottom of the slide shows the street as a temporary car park following clearance, although you might just pick out that the High Street itself still survived. One of the most significant losses to the bulldozer was the so-called Tudor House at No. 4 North Quay. This was a 17th century building reputed to have been the harbour master's house. The upper part of the projecting bay that you see in the middle of this picture was conjectured to have been where he kept an eye on harbour traffic. The building was a guest house prior to the Second World War, but had been abandoned and was in decay when this was taken in the early 1960s. Despite well-publicised debates and protests about the fate of the Tudor house, it was demolished shortly after this photo was taken. Nevertheless, a photographic survey was carried out of the building, and these images are from that survey. This also comprised interior shots including the remains of a fine wood-turned staircase, pictured here. Construction of the office building was in full swing when this photo was taken in 1970, although part of the street outside of the site continued to be recognisable. Of course, the history of Weymouth goes much further back than the modern period, and there is tentative evidence that a settlement was founded here in the 10th century. What we do know with more certainty is that Weymouth became incorporated as a borough in 1252. For much of this early period, the town was in direct competition with Melcombe Regis, a separate town on the opposite side of the harbour. The two were often in disputes, and by 1570 the Crown had finally lost patience with their squabbling and merged the two into a single town. Unlike Melcombe Regis, Weymouth was physically constrained by surrounding topography, and this early map of 1590 emphasises this, if only in artistic terms. So, taken together, Weymouth can chart its history back to the medieval period, if not slightly earlier. Fast forward to 2021, and in light of the recent proposals for redevelopment of the site, The big question was, does any of this survive as archaeological remains beneath the ground? In the early summer of 2021, we had the opportunity to find out. Before putting a spade in the ground, we first had to come up with a strategy to maximise the effectiveness of the investigation. We agreed on 4 10-metre long trenches spread across the site and positioned to coincide with former buildings along the High Street and North Quay. This is never easy in towns, as there are often numerous constraints to take account of. This plan is perhaps a good example of this. Forgive the messy appearance, but I think it illustrates the point. The underlying map is the 1958 edition, which incidentally shows the ruins I spoke of earlier. Layered on top of this is the office building in grey, and then all the various live services crisscrossing the site. Armed with this draft, we met with Steve Wallace and Carly Galloway from Dorset Council on site to discuss this further. A few tweaks later, we were ready to incorporate this into a written scheme of investigation, which provided the full details of our methodology. The resulting plan looked like this. As all the trenches were located in the car park, the tarmac was broken with a JCB and modern layers removed to the first archaeological horizon. All the work after this was carried out by hand tools. We're grateful to Dorset Council Highways for their sterling work here. Trench 1 was located in close proximity to one of the key arenas of the Civil War battle in Weymouth during 1645, and what later maps identify as numbers 2 and 3 High Street. The map on the left is an extract from the 1866 Ordnance Survey map, with the red rectangle representing the trench. I think the first thing to say is that any scepticism we had of whether anything might have survived was quickly dispelled. As you can see, in this part of the site at least, we have plenty of archaeology, literally just centimetres below the tarmac. The photo plan at the top of the slide shows the full extent of the archaeology encountered and matches surprisingly well with the old map. At the far left of the image, I've highlighted the wall which divides the two properties, and we've interpreted this as late 18th and early 19th century in date. Map evidence indicates that number 2 was removed by the early 20th century and replaced with a new building. This included a hearth against the party wall. The other end of the trench is prominent for the remnants of a small flagstone floor and forms part of an extension known to have been present in the late 1920s. A stone threshold is all that remains of the back wall before the extension was added. The east to west aligned wall encountered within the centre of the trench is particularly interesting. This was covered over when number 2 was replaced, but the alignment fits well with the rear of a property on 18th century maps. This is a substantial wall with clay bonding and set into the natural clay. Pottery dating to the 12th to 15th century was found alongside it, and this could well be the partial remains of a medieval property that survived into the Victorian period. Unfortunately, there was no direct evidence relating to the Civil War battle in this trench, although the fleeting nature of such events can sometimes leave little trace in the archaeological record. But the hunt continues. Photographs from the 1930s show the replacement to number 2 was a lesser single-storey stone building just visible next to the former Fisherman's Arms pub. Trench 2 was positioned as close to the Tudor house as possible, but sadly any remains are under the northeast corner of the office building. Nevertheless, this 1920s photograph shows its neighbour on the far left of the picture and appears to be of possible Georgian origin. The ground floor appears to have been a shop. While we had hopes to see the foundations of this building, it was pulled down in the late 1920s, and photos from the 1930s show a conglomeration of commercial premises serving as a garage. This initially caused us some confusion, as the map sequence jumps from the Georgian building and then a vacant plot on the 1958 map, with none of the additions in between showing the garage. There's a lesson here for us researchers. As the trench was positioned towards the back of the plot, we caught a number of brick walls that aligned to various outbuildings on the 1866 map onwards. Crucially, however, we appear to have captured the edge of the rear wall to the Georgian property that extended most of the way along the top edge of the trench as viewed here. The rather well-preserved section of flagstone floor appears to be contemporary, with 2 square flagstones marking a door threshold. Amongst the more modern disturbance in various drain runs, we also found a rather nicely decorated stone surround to a fireplace or door frame of Georgian date. Trench 3 was positioned to mostly cover number 11 High Street. However, the excavation of this trench proved surprisingly more for the lack of archaeology than anything else. I think the photo plan at the top of the slide speaks for itself. For whatever reason, and we think it was to do with levelling this part of the site flat, the ground here had been excavated away in the early 1970s as part of the construction of the office block and filled with aggregate. The picture at the bottom right, showing the finishing of groundworks at the rear of the offices, is probably an indication of how widespread this disturbance might have been. We even found tooth marks from a JCB bucket at the bottom of the trench nearly 1.5 metres down. Remarkably, however, there was still a little archaeology here, and you might pick out a more orangey section at the far right-hand side of the photo plan and a slither of the same running along the top of the picture. This represented a wall and its return, part of which is within the red dashed lines. The return appears to represent the boundary wall between numbers 11 and 10, but we think the longer section of the wall relates to a much earlier building and one that appears to have been rebuilt and slightly realigned. Interestingly, the most substantial section of the wall at the far eastern end was both clay bonded and set into the natural clay, and once again found in association with a few sherds of medieval pottery, all very similar to the wall in Trench 1. The photo in the middle of the slide, taken just before demolition in 1959, shows the last iteration of the building. A Louis Basso owned number 11 in the 1920s and added the brick second storey seen in the photo. Given that Trench 4 was situated on the site of the ruin mentioned earlier, it was not too surprising to find that the deposit sequence was dominated by a series of demolition deposits, some of which may even relate to collapse resulting from World War II blast damage. Nevertheless, a well-preserved section of a stone wall was present near the east end, the far left in the photo plan, where the demolition sequence was at its thinnest. This fits well with the dividing wall between numbers 19 and 20 High Street as depicted on the 1866 OS map. Although no dating evidence was recovered from the wall, the stone construction and clay bonding is in keeping with the late medieval or post-medieval date, although a small amount of white mortar perhaps favours the later phase. The wall appears to have been associated with a beaten earth floor, with evidence of a nearby hearth reflected in the burned and heat-affected surface, and is contemporary with an arrangement of stones that might reflect an internal partition with threshold. Unlike the other trenches where we saw the plan of the buildings just before demolition, this section of the trench appears to have been stripped down to an early phase of use by the bulldozers in the early 1970s, during groundworks for the car park. So instead of a pre-war layout, our excavation revealed its post-medieval or earlier plan straight away. The rest of the trench was largely dominated by the impact of blast damage, while the far end of the trench showed the former line of the boundary between numbers 21 and 22. A notable resident in number 20 in the mid-19th century was Robert White, a retired commander of the Post Office Packet Service. Robert lived at number 20 with his wife Anne, grandson and servant. Earlier in his career, in 1826, he reached notoriety for allowing a packet service to sail in adverse weather conditions, which was lost with all 16 hands near Portland, having struck another vessel in foggy conditions. An early 20th century photo in the centre of the slide gives number 20 and its neighbours a three-dimensional appearance, and shows a tall but narrow edifice that includes a possible ground floor shop. As you can imagine, the evaluation produced a huge array of finds from pottery, animal bone, glass and metalwork. Perhaps not surprisingly, the vast majority of finds were modern and a testament to the last years and days of the High Street before demolition. These represent the full range of domestic assemblages along with a few tools and various fittings, and together they conjure a picture of ordinary life either side of the wall. Before I conclude, a brief word on new techniques that we applied at North Quay, and this includes 3D recording. The science of archaeological investigation is ever advancing, and we've been experimenting with new ways of adding even more information to our site records. North Quay was a good example of this continuing endeavour. We were extremely fortunate to have a company called Occupies get in touch to offer to undertake a 3D record of Trenches 1 and 2. The results were incredibly detailed, and we're grateful to Graham Knott of Deeper Dorset for undertaking the site photography and Simon Brown from Archaeological for processing the images to create amazingly accurate 3D models. Inspired by this, we produced some lower resolution models ourselves using an iPad Pro using LiDAR technology, and the image and video in this slide are from that survey. Evaluations by their nature can only offer a limited insight into the extent of human activity on any given site, but the results here clearly demonstrate a high potential across significant areas of the site for the discovery of remains spanning the history of the town that could yield important and unique information on the evolution of Weymouth. As a final note, Context 1 gratefully acknowledges the considerable help and support from volunteers who assisted the excavation, including those from Dig the Street community group headed by Mark Vine. The depth of local knowledge and enthusiasm for the project was both invaluable and inspiring, and the results reflect their endeavours. Special thanks go to Mark, Claire, Lorraine, Jason, Jim, Mike, Kat and Imogen from Dig the Street, as well as student volunteers Rob Cook and Eleanor Ander. We would also like to thank Lynn at the Belvedere Inn for some very fine lunches. Thank you.